And welcome to this Dialogue Web Extra. I'm Marcia Franklin. I'm here with Paul Farhi. He is a media reporter for the Washington Post. Well, I'm actually not here with him. He's appearing, the avatar of him is with me. He's in our Moscow studio at KUID. Thanks so much for continuing our conversation, Mr. Farhi.
Sure, thank you, Marcia.
I wanted to talk a little bit more with you about what you do and what you cover as a media reporter. In the main program, we talked about the fact that this really is, in many respects, a business story as much as it is a culture story. You know, you cover new television programs that are starting, but you're also covering acquisitions, mergers, startups. I mean, we have this changeable media world. We've got Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, starting First Look with Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, who have access to the Snowden material. We've got the Texas Tribune. We've got ProPublica, SCOTUS blog. I mean, there's all these people and money. There's all this money out there trying to figure out what the next iteration of journalism is going to look like.
Exactly, and that kind of makes it a very exciting time to be a journalist, but as I was saying on the program, it's also a time of great anxiety. You have a lot of money coming into these high-profile ventures, a few of which you've mentioned, but you know the real question is who's going to provide the local news? Where is the money for that? And local news is what mostly the media does. So, you know, as you have these high-profile, glamorous kind of startups, you know, the real underlying issue is what is the future of the day-to-day, you know, city council coverage, school coverage, crime, government on the local level. And we, again, haven't figured it out.
Right, because some of those hyper-local ventures like The Patch, and even something else I think that Omidyar funded, they're not doing so well.
Right, because the economic nature of the internet is geared toward aggregating large audiences. Hyperlocal, by definition, has a very limited audience, and it's very difficult to get an advertising base that would support the news gathering that creates those hyperlocal sites. So it's almost at odds with the nature of starting one of these hyperlocal sites in the first place. Patch, you know, had 900 plus sites all over the country, all these little sites covering all these little communities, and it appears to be a pretty distressed property at this point. Questions about whether it will survive. AOL sold it. And then there have been dozens and dozens of other hyperlocal startups, experiments that have come and gone. It's a very difficult business to make a go of. You know, just as background, when you had one newspaper covering a relatively small territory, you had essentially a monopoly, and advertisers had one place to go, and that's a pretty good business. You know, the internet is all about abundance, and there's lots of places for advertisers to go. So, you know, Pierre Omidyar is a very good example. He's a philanthropist. There's no sense that this is necessarily going to be a huge profit-making venture. It may be something that may have to be supported, like ProPublica you mentioned, as a charitable function, that news might be a nonprofit charitable notion, not a for-profit business as it has been for hundreds of years.
And it's interesting, you know, I was standing in line at our local newspaper offices recently waiting to see somebody, and so I was, you know, eavesdropping, if you will, into the conversations of the people in front of me. And one man was there to complain that he cannot find the times of the local university baseball club games in the newspaper anymore. Another man was there to pick up a physical copy of the local TV guide. I asked him afterwards if he has the internet, and he said, oh gosh, no, we don't even have a computer. We'd never get one. So we're in this kind of, you know, merging of one generation that still needs the physical paper, wants the physical paper, well, needs it actually,
Right.
and another that isn't taking it anymore and wants it fast and free on the internet.
Sure. Well, the internet has created this unbelievable, river of information. And the baseball schedule is probably somewhere out there if you can find it. The obits are somewhere if you can find them. Everything is probably out there. The question is can you find it? What newspapers have always done is kind of bring together in a supermarket-like way all of that information. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And so it became a central focus. The internet has kind of torn this all apart and sent it, to the winds. But there's lots and lots of information, more than there's ever been, obviously, about everything. But try finding it and try knowing where it is, and you don't know what you didn't know about, and unless you go looking for it, you may not find it at all. Look, one of the joys for me in reading a newspaper is turning the page and finding an article I didn't think I was interested in. You can sort of do that on the internet, but it's not quite the same kind of model. And
well, as you've pointed out, there's these companies that put articles at the bottom of what you read, thinking that will lead you there, and they get more bizarre and more bizarre. Like the mismatches happen. They think you want to read about some babes in bikinis on a beach.
But that's a form of advertising. In other words, someone
Right.
paid to put those links there and those little thumbnail photos there at the bottom of the page. And so, we're allowing advertisers to really run the agenda. I'm not saying advertisers haven't had influence, they have. But in that case, it's purely a paid kind of sponsorship. It doesn't really necessarily make it inherently bad, but a lot of that stuff is really bad. And it's better when journalists decide what they know is of value to a readership that they have lived with day in and day out than advertisers coming from across the country or around the world trying to influence you to read their stuff because they're trying to sell you something.
Right.
It's not journalism as I was brought up to recognize it.
Well, and of course, as you mentioned, there's something soothing about reading a physical paper, but nowadays the news has already bypassed a lot of times what's in the physical paper. Now, the Washington Post, your competitor, the New York Times, you both have vibrant online sites and with paywalls. Mm-hmm. So this is where we're headed, is it not? Although the aggregators can still get a hold of that information, aggregate it, and summarize it for free.
Well, I don't know if it's where we're headed. It's where we are right now, but I don't know if it's the long-term strategy. It seems to be working really well for the New York Times, but the New York Times is kind of different than every other paper, including the Washington Post. It's a very large, very international, very robust newspaper. We are probably the closest to it in America, along with a handful of other big papers. But nevertheless, I wonder about a small paper in Idaho or Kansas or somewhere else as to whether they can make a go of it with a similar model, having a paywall and essentially making their readers pay for what they've come to expect as free. There may not be enough of an audience to aggregate to make that kind of strategy viable. The New York Times has a readership all around the world. It only has to get a tiny fraction of its worldwide readership to agree to pay for full access to really make a strong business. It's not clear that a small newspaper or a small news site somewhere can replicate the same model and have the same business going.
Well, I have to say there are inspirational stories out there, including in our region. I made a documentary, and part of it was interviewing the editor of a small paper in an eastern Oregon town, John Day area, and she and her husband had come from the Oregonian and to work on that paper and edit it, and it's quite successful. It's hyper-local. They also are active on Facebook. They web stream town hall meetings. So there are instances where people are really wedded to their local paper, and sometimes it can work.
I love those entrepreneurial stories because that has created so much vibrancy in the news business. And the story you just told is replicated in lots of communities across America. There are literally hundreds of hyperlocal and local and community news sites. Some of them are nonprofits. Some of them is just a guy who wants to be able to put news up online about what's happening in his neighborhood. And they don't necessarily have to be big businesses, I understand that, but to have a professional reporting staff, to have people to go and collect the news does take some money, and it can't be done for free forever. The guy who's just starting his own site, look, that's going to be a very, very difficult proposition if he wants to pay his rent and mortgage and feed his family. It's not necessarily a business that you can count on for a lot to support you.
Going back to the Oregonian now, there's been a lot of press recently. There was a leaked information to the Willamette Weekly. By the way, some independents, like those newspapers, are still doing quite well in terms of advertisers. But this information was that reporters there, and the newspaper's been decimated, but they're going to be judged. They're going to have a quota, and they're going to be judged on how much traffic comes to their articles online. Mm-hmm. And they're going to be required to post the first comment underneath their own articles, and keep ramping that up.
We find this frightening. We who've been in the news business for a long time are very, very afraid of this. Now, it may well be that the Oregonian and its company, Advance Publications, they're the only ones who are going to do that. And from our perspective, we certainly hope so, because if you did this all over the country, I think it would change not just our working environment, but what we produce all day. If your emphasis is on quantity, ask yourself what kind of quality you're going to have. I'm not saying that every article needs to be a 6-month investigative project, but the news does take some time. And look, we've got plenty of errors creeping in because we are under tremendous time pressures and tremendous quantity and quota pressures. Just wait until you are under the gun for your livelihood in producing as fast as you can on an assembly line. Ask yourself how much quality is going to be maintained in that kind of situation.
Well, it seems like it's almost a Gawker model, because Gawker has been very open about how it pays its writers, let's call them, pays them by the popularity of their articles, and we're now, in this instance, potentially applying that model to journalists as well.
But I would say Gawker is not quite the same as the Oregonian for the following
reason.
Well,
no, I agree. Yeah,
Gawker is a gossip site that doesn't have necessarily a geographical territory. It's not a news operation per se, although it does.
But it's this model that's coming from, the model is coming from that arena and potentially creeping into journalism.
Yes, and if you're going to cover the news that way, you're going to have a lot of unforeseen consequences, or perhaps they're foreseen consequences. But I don't think it's a long-term strategy, because eventually the readers are going to see that I'm not reading an edited and reported newspaper. I'm reading a paper mill that is simply producing on an assembly line. And, quality still counts. Readers do care about the quality of the information they're getting. And again, when you turn the screws on reporters, you can have very, very bad outcomes.
Well, I love the David Carr article on this, where he ended by showing a picture of a cat at the bottom when he was talking about this this model that the Oregonian may be using. Back to errors that you mentioned that can creep up in this type of situation. You've also written about the fact that in this fast-paced world of journalism, both online and broadcast, errors don't seem to count for much anymore because they can be corrected just as fast as they're out there. However, then they're out there. I mean, and in the case of, say, Adam Lanza's brother, who was erroneously identified as a mass murderer, they can have long-lasting effects. I mean, he could have actually been targeted by somebody in the interim between being identified and then having that error corrected. But yes, all of this information it seems like speed is the denominator here, or the goal, as opposed to accuracy.
No, that's absolutely the case. And again, going back to the Oregonian, when you make the news a race, and it always has been, you are going to, you're going to screw up. I've screwed up. Everybody else in the media has. There's no way around it. But you attempt to get it as accurate as you can under the limitations of deadlines. Now, if your deadlines are the next 30 seconds, you don't have a whole lot of chance to double check what you're putting out there. And that was the case in all of these breaking stories. The Newtown shootings, the Navy Yard shootings in Washington, the Boston Marathon bombings, they are riddled with errors. It is almost as if readers and viewers should wait a few hours to know what's going on, because the initial reports inevitably are going to be fraught with errors. It's just part of the process. But look, I mean, newspapers were never perfect, or else there wouldn't be a big headline that said, Dewey defeats Truman. We've done this before. We're now, again, in a different era where this is bound to occur more often. But again, as the point I was trying to make in that article is that because we have speed, because we have instantaneousness, you don't have to wait till tomorrow to correct what you got wrong. I hear from a reader that I screwed something up. The correction should, in a perfect world, go up 30 seconds later and say, we got it wrong. So it's not that errors are justifiable, they're understandable, but we now have a better mechanism for correcting what we mess up. And I don't know that that engenders a whole lot more trust from our readers and viewers, but the fact is we can correct better than we've ever done before.
Well, I'll put a pitch in here for SCOTUS blog, because that's what I, quote, turned on when I wanted to hear about the Supreme Court decision on the Health Care Act. And I love the way that the reporter said, hold on, we're reading the decision. We'll be back with you soon. And they got it right, and they got it first. So, and it was an old-time, print reporter making sure that happened.
Which is why a lot of people in the media read SCOTUS blog, because we know that they are going to get it right, and that they're trustworthy and they're reliable and they're credible. Look, that's what we have always tried to sell in the media, that why would you read us instead of, say, the National Enquirer? Well, because you kind of trust us to get the news right, more or less, hopefully more, than another source. And that's kind of what we have to sell as reporters, that we can be accurate. You remember what happened in that Supreme Court decision. CNN and Fox News both went on the air, reported that one thing was the case when in fact it was the exact opposite, because they only read the summary page, which didn't get into the conclusions, and they were forced to admit, we messed it up. Now, again, I'm not sure how much damage results from messing up and then 32 minutes later saying, we messed up, here's the correct information. The only thing that it really does is undermine the credibility generally of CNN or Fox News or anyone who reports something inaccurate. But, as I tried to say in that article, look, that interim was a very short period. They did get it right. they did correct what they had wrong. Would they have liked to have not reported it wrong in the first place? Of course. And you know, the old line about get it first is important, but get it right is the more important value.
Well, I suppose it doesn't do much damage unless you're the actual physical victim of a misidentification.
Well, that
or
case, yes.
Thinking that your loved one is alive when they're not, or thinking your loved one is dead when they're not. I mean, you know, it's, we always have to remember, I think, as journalists, that there are real people behind a lot of these facts that we're putting out there, and they can be very affected by incorrect things. And one other subject you've written about that I found both serious and amusing is something that I've noticed, which is this absolute proliferation of anonymous sources in articles, in print articles, mostly because as television reporters, you know, we have to physically interview somebody. If they're anonymous, the viewer sees that they're darkened, or you know, their voice is altered or something. But in newspapers and then online, we see these strange excuses for why somebody won't give their name. Some of them serious, but some of them rather bizarre and amusing.
Yep.
What, you know, I'll link your article for our viewers, but do you think this is doing damage to the profession, all these anonymous sources? I assume it'll just continue with the deep chill that's going on and people being fearful of their names being published because the government might get a hold of it.
Well, I have to say that one of the things that does drive readers and probably viewers crazy is the idea that you're using anonymous sources, particularly anonymous sources, to rip somebody else or criticize somebody else with this screen of anonymity. That really isn't fair, and we try, I don't know if we succeed, but we try not to do that. But there are justifiable cases in which the reader is better served by having anonymous sources. The reader would not be aware of the thing being reported unless the reporter was able to get this information from someone who was otherwise unwilling to go on the record with their name. So this is not an attack on anonymous sourcing. It's an attack on reporters who use pretty flimsy descriptions to tell you why they used anonymous sources. It doesn't help anybody to say who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they didn't want to offend, you know, the other side, or they were attempting to keep relations with the other side that they are now criticizing. This is kind of silly. This is cryptic. Why even bother doing it? It doesn't help the reader, and it just makes the reporter look silly. And you know, we are trying to be more transparent. We are trying to tell you why someone wouldn't speak anonymously, or excuse me, on the record. You know, to me, the only way you can justify describing why a source was anonymous was to tell about the consequences that the source faces if he had spoken or she had spoken on the record. In other words, I saw one in the LA Times where someone was speaking about a murder, and the description was so-and-so who spoke without using her name because she feared retaliation from one of the perpetrators of this terrible murder. I thought, well, that's a pretty good use of anonymous sourcing. If I'm going to get killed by talking to you, I'm not going to talk to you if you're going to use my name. So I'm not saying every instance is that extreme, but of course in Washington we know the reason people don't want to speak with their names attached to it because they know it's going to be critical, or it's going to be controversial for them, or it's going to cause them some kind of distress. You know, to me, we create a fiction that someone has valid and justifiable reasons when they do not have any such thing.
Well, you have a fascinating job, no dearth of stories to cover as a media reporter in Washington, D.C. Sure. I thank you. I thank you for sharing some of your time with me and our viewers so we can understand this world a little bit better, and look forward to reading more articles from you as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Paul Farhi. Mr. Farhi is a media reporter for The Washington Post. I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in to this Dialogue Web Extra.